Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you. So this is the ordinary meeting of Philological Society. I'm afraid we don't have any membership numbers to share with you, so we'll have to defer that report. Apparently, there are lots of new members, so we'll defer that report to June. But in the meantime, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Amalia Arvaniti, who's Professor of English Language and Linguistics at Radboud University in the Netherlands. Now, she was previously Professor of English Language and Linguistics at Kent between 2012 and 2020, and Professor of Linguistics at the University of California, San Diego. She's also been the editor of the Journal of the International Phonetic Association. She's currently Vice President of the International Phonetic Association and Chair of the ICPHS Permanent Council. Her research, as you'll have seen from the abstract, focuses on the cross-linguistic study of prosody. Has been widely published, and she's been very widely cited too, and has led to paradigm shifts in the study of intonation and rhythm. She's currently the PI of a European Research Council advanced grant entitled SPRINT, and that really stands for speech, prosody, and interaction. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Amalia.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great honor to be here. Now, you've seen my title, so the talk is about intonation, and I will be talking about some recent advances in our research trying to solve some both technical and theoretical problems. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the funding, of course, from the ERC and my collaborators, without whom this work would not, I would not be here today presenting this work. So what I will do, because I know that intonation is not a topic that many people know a lot about, I will have a longish introduction on what intonation is, what its role is in speech, language, and communication, and then talk briefly about the challenges that intonation research presents, and I will show how we try to solve these problems in SPRINT by presenting you with a production study and a perception study that deal with a contrast, the high star versus low high star contrast in English. If you're not familiar with these annotations, this work is couched in autosegmental metrical terms, and I will be explaining those terms as we go along. So I will start with a few definitions, and the reason why we need these definitions is because in the last few years, at least, if not much longer, terms like fundamental frequency, F0, pitch, and intonation are often used interchangeably, but they mean different things. So I'll start with this little schema here. In the middle, you have F0, that's fundamental frequency, and it is an acoustic measurement that derives from the rate at which our vocal folds vibrate. That is how many times they close and open in a second. And this measurement is determined to a very large extent by physiology. So it relates to your biological sex, your age, and your size. So what you hear right now is somebody who is relatively short and female. Now, because of these physiological connotations, the F0 can be used also for indexical purposes and paralinguistic purposes. So we can use the pitch of our voice to indicate things like boredom, excitement, anger, and so on. So the paralinguistic part, as well as indexical properties such as performing gender. For example, this is one of the most common ones. But these are not the things that we'll be talking about today. These things have to do with F0 in general. What I will be focusing on is intonation, and I put it separately because I'm talking about the grammatical functions that F0 can have. And these grammatical functions have four main flavors, if you like. The intonation can be used to indicate utterance modality, focus, phrasal structure, and pragmatics. And I will illustrate each one of these points before we go on with the studies, because it's important that this is relatively clear. So intonation and utterance modality. So very often when you talk to people about intonation, they will say, well, oh, it's about distinguishing questions from statements. But this is very much an oversimplification of what intonation does. And the reason why this is oversimplified is because the relationship between intonation form and intonation function is not one-to-one, but many-to-many. So tunes are interpreted in context, and this is something that goes back to at least Daniel Jones, if not longer than that. However, it's something that in the last few decades seems to have been forgotten. And so very often you hear people talk about question intonation or focus intonation or ironic intonation. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean by tunes interpreted in context. This is me saying my name, as I often do, because it's a name people don't often recognize. So I might say, my name is Amalia, right? And I will have a rise at the end. Now, if I say that in this context here, say to a young lady in a hairdresser salon, for example. So I come in and I say, good morning, my name is Amalia. Obviously, she is not going to think that I'm asking her what my name is. She recognizes that I'm telling her my name. And at the same time, I am asking if she can see my name on her computer. Let's find my appointment. So this is one function. Now here's another situation. I've been in a car accident. I wake up in hospital and the lady next to me says, oh, Amalia, thank God you're awake. And I turn around and I say, my name is Amalia. She will immediately call the doctor and say, you know, this lady has amnesia. So in this case, she will interpret the exact same tune as an actual question. And this is not the only example. I found examples in an American TV show very recently, but the quality was too bad to replicate here, to bring here. But I think you get my drift that we cannot have this one-to-one relationship. It would be lovely if we could, but that's not possible. Now, another thing that I mentioned intonation does is indicate focus. But this is not a straightforward relationship as it's often presented. So it works in an indirect way because intonation is used to highlight specific words by means of what in the AM system are known as pitch accents. So the high star that you see over there, the star really tells you that this is a pitch accent. And what do we mean by this is that this is a melodic element, part of a tune that is phonologically associated with a metrically strong syllable, and it is phonetically synchronized with it. Okay? So in order to understand how intonation works, you need those representations of the tune, the abstract representations, but also the metrical structure that tells you where elements need to dock off in phonology and eventually phonetically as well. So when we use intonation in this way, when we put pitch accents on particular words, we can indicate focus, but focus often involves also de-accentuation, okay? Which means that elements that would normally have been accented do not carry an accent, and this tells you which element you're supposed to think of as being in focus. So this is not I put the accent or I don't use the accent, it's a combination of the two. And I'll illustrate it, I'm sure you know this joke of the man who saw this sign and was worried because he did not have a dog. Guys, okay, what is the humorous interpretation of this utterance is that there is only one accent on dogs, right? Dogs must be carried, right? So this puts dogs in narrow focus, as we would say in intonation terms, but most importantly, it de-accents carried. So carried does not have an accent. So this is a rudimentary metrical grid. So by doing this, we're saying carried is given, and now you must figure out what is the thing that has to be carried, and this is dogs, right? Of course, the intended meaning is dogs must be carried, where you have two accents on dogs and on carried. The main accent is on carried. That's what some of you may refer to as sentence stress. And the accent on dogs now makes dogs into a topic, right? As far as dogs are concerned, they have to be carried. Okay? So it's not a straightforward, here is focus, we make things longer and they become focused. Okay, it goes through metrical structure. A function of intonation that is often neglected is what happens with phrasal marking. So one of the things that I heard recently, to my horror, was somebody saying that speech is a sequence of words. Okay, we don't produce sequence of words, we don't produce sequences of sounds, we organize them in a hierarchical prosodic structure. We organize sounds into syllables, syllables into feet, and feet into increasingly larger constituents that are to a certain extent language specific. And these larger constituents from the prosodic word, which may include something like a noun with any clitics around it, in other languages there could be all sorts of particles involved, are very often demarcated by intonation. So the way this is done is by having melodic changes at the edges of these prosodic constituents, and which means on the very last units that can carry F0, and these are collectively known, I won't go into the formal details, as edge tones. The fact that we use intonation this way means that it helps us process. So for example, as a native speaker of Greek, which has a lot of these particles, I often find it difficult to follow non-native speakers because they don't know where to put the brakes. Okay? So I understand different things from what they intend. So these are the edge tones, and this is exploited quite a lot in English with all the memes that you may have seen about the Oxford comma, right? Comma, sorry. What is the humorous interpretation here? That I love cooking, my pets and my family is produced as one phrase, and in that case, cooking and pets who don't have breaks, and therefore pets and family are interpreted as the objects of cooking. Of course, the intended meaning here is cooking, my pets, and my family. So we say phrases of cooking and pets, and this changes overall the structure that we understand from a syntactic perspective and makes cooking, pets, and family the objects of love instead. So this is the one of the functions that intonation has for us. And yes, there are additional ways in which we can show this phrasing, but intonation is a main one. Now we can, all of these things don't exist one at a time. We can actually combine them together. And this creates what to me is the most interesting part, which is the implicatures, is the communication part and spread. The fact that we can use intonation not to explain something, but to actually imply it with the way we say things. And this is one of my favorite examples from the corpus I will be presenting. Hope you can hear it. I don't have a flamingo. Why did you laugh? Because it sounds funny. Why does it sound funny? We'll unpack this a little bit. Hear it again. Perhaps a little bit. Make it a little bit louder. I don't have a flamingo. Okay. So we have a woman who says I don't have a pink flamingo and a guy who ends up with okay. What they were doing is they were taking part in a map task. This is a task in which two people have maps. The man in this particular case has a map with a path in it, and the woman doesn't have the path, so he has to give her instructions so she can recreate the path on her map. The problem is that they didn't know that their maps were not identical, so the man was insisting that she should find the pink flamingo. And after she tried a couple of times, she ended up with saying, I don't have a pink flamingo. Right? And to which he realized, okay, right? So now he gets it. She doesn't have a pink flamingo, right? What did she do in this particular case? Obviously, having a pink flamingo was something that was already given. It was discussed repeatedly. So what she did is, first of all, she had two phrases. I don't have, puts a break in there, a pink flamingo. And then she puts an accent on every single word. Okay? And this is what creates this interpretation that we wouldn't have otherwise, because normally we would expect just an accent on don't and everything else to be de-accented, because we already know this is the case. And you can see that her interlocutor picks it up immediately. Okay, don't worry, I won't talk about this again. Incidentally, this tune is not very unusual if you speak Greek, and I've often been told by English people that we talk like we're emphasized every single word, but we're not. It's just, right, it's interpreted in a very different way, so the interpretation is language specific. So intonation does all of those things, and because of the way everybody here responded, it shows that we actually have expectations about what melodies are appropriate in different contexts. And so when things don't go as we expect, we have different ways of dealing with it. Something may seem pragmatically odd and we may let it go, or we may ask for a repair and clarification. But tunes can be also inappropriate. That's particularly the case with L2 speakers, because as L2 speakers, we often are not taught intonation, and because this is seen as kind of difficult and all the rest of it. But it's actually the biggest problem you have. If you use the wrong tense, nobody will get offended. If you use the wrong intonation, they might. Here is an example that I didn't put in Dutch. Which I now have to learn. You can say thank you, and you can say dank u wel. Okay, there's a big accent on wel. Now, if I say thanks a lot, that's not very, it's not the most polite way to say that in English. So if I were a Dutch speaker transferring this tune to English, it would work really badly. The other thing we can do is try to interpret what is going on, and this is what generates the implicatures, and some of us, as we will see, are better at doing this than others. Now, we can explore these expectations, for example, quite a lot with irony. I don't have time to go into this, but I have a slide with some examples. We can use intonation to indicate irony, not because there's such a thing as an ironic tone of voice, but because what we seem to be doing is defy the expectations, go in the opposite direction from what is expected. I hope that I have convinced you so far that intonation plays a very big role in grammar on the one hand, because it interacts with phonetics, phonology, and syntax at least, and in communication. And you would expect it would be central, but at least in the study of speech and communicative approaches to speech. But instead, what we see, especially in the last 20 years or so, I would say, two major approaches that I personally I don't particularly like. One is treating intonation as if intonation is a bunch of atheoretical measurements. So measuring average of 0, for example, and the other is to treat it as an optional enhancement. So sometimes I read, especially in psycholinguistic literature or literature from psychology or education, we ask their participants to speak without prosody or without intonation, or the stimuli were prosodically enhanced, as if it is possible to produce speech without prosody, which is just a physical impossibility. Now, what is the problem with these approaches? The first one suggests that intonation lacks linguistic structure, and therefore we can bypass phonology, right? So what this effectively means is we can look for the phonetic exponents of focus without looking at the mediation via phonology, which is where the focus is going to be expressed first before it becomes a phonetic parameter of some type. So we see work where people look at focus and look at duration to see if there's a connection between the two. But if we were looking, say, at the lexical semantics, you would not think of concepts from lexical semantics and how they're phonetically realized. You would look at what lexical items and what phonological representations those items have before you go into the phonetics. In terms of the optional enhancement, we also see very much that it can be switched on and off, which it cannot be. So why is this happening? I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, alphabetical writing. Alphabetical writing has conditioned us to think that the primary things are consonants and vowels. My ancestors who didn't even use punctuation are quite a lot to answer for. And also the term that is associated with this tradition, which is the term suprasegmentals, which I suppose is quite familiar to most people. The problem that I have with the term suprasegmentals is that it presents speech as if it's made up of a primary component, which is the vowels and the consonants, and everything else, like intonation, is just the icing on the cake, not something that is necessary, and also not something that is segmented. So we take it for granted that speech, although it's messy, can be segmented into vowels and consonants, but we assume that somehow intonation does not have a structure. So we can just look at F0 as a big blob. And I admit that intonation is challenging. This is the tune we saw earlier. We don't have a pink flamingo. It's a squiggly line, and finding which elements of that line are important, how they associate with vowels and consonants, what does not matter in this squiggly line is not an easy thing to do. But this is what we're trying to do in Spring. First of all, we take an approach, it's a play on words, that intonation is tame. Where does this come from? You may be familiar with Bollinger's metaphor that Carlos Hussenhoven has made very popular, that intonation is an untamed savage. Okay, so my approach is no, it is tame. It is tame, it is systematic, it is similar to segments. Now that we have massive studies of speech, we know that segments are very, very variable, and intonation is not more so. And its phonetic encoding involves redundancy, as with everything else. So when we say, for example, that a consonant is voiced or voiceless, we don't only look at whether there is a voicing bar in the phonetic in phonetics, we look at a number of different cues, which involve, as a matter of fact, F0 among a lot of other things. So intonation involves not just F0, but other phonetic exponents, and we can use that to our advantage. In addition, we assume that AM actually covers essential features of intonation, and I'll be talking about the British approaches very soon. And we try to improve on the standard practices of AM so as to get a better understanding of how intonation works. And I will exemplify this with the study of low, high, and high star. So what are these annotations? These are annotations that come from originally from Janet Pure-Hambert's dissertation, and they refer to two different pitch accents. Okay, here is a rundown of what they look like. So the high star is meant to be high or rising, whereas the low high star is a rise from a low point. And this is illustrated with figures here. So if this is the duration of the accented syllable, and this is the speaker's range, you have a rise in one case and a rise from a low point in the other. Now, in AM, these are not the equivalent of the IPA for intonation. Okay, these are meant to be phonological representations. So they are meant to reflect different morphology and therefore different meanings. So in the original work, this accent is meant to be used for new or broad focus items, and this one informally for contrastive, corrective, narrow focus items. So a little bit more formal, but still very informally, the high star is supposed to highlight the element that you're supposed to place in the common ground between the speaker and the addressee, whereas this one is meant to tell you which item from a small set of alternatives is the one to put in the common ground. But we'll get to that if that's correct. Now, since the 1980s, this has been a point of controversy, with Bob Ladd on the one hand saying this is not accurate. In North America, it's taken for granted that this distinction is correct. What is the empirical evidence? When it comes to Northern American varieties, we have studies that look at eye tracking, and those studies find that when listeners hear a rising tune, then they have a preference for the contrastive interpretation. So if you say, now go to the red triangle, they will be looking at, and they hear a red with a rising tune, they will be looking for a shape that is a shape they've heard before. But when we look at the production of these items in different varieties of American English, we find that the speakers do not actually differentiate the two accents. It depends on the variety very much. In British English, we have a different situation, which is not very much clearer. So when it comes to the British school, the rises are not very often mentioned. So in the British school, you normally talk about a high fall and a low fall. There is a rise fall, but it's a different tune. The rise associated with the high, with the falls, is sometimes mentioned. And for example, Daniel Jones has this little line, so he has the typical, sure you know the tadpole notation, and he has these little lines drawn on top to show that there's actually a rise. And he says that these are emphatic and can be used contrastively. Pochansky Dal, on the other hand, as part of the Ivy corpus, they did work which suggests that it doesn't matter if you have the rise. Whether you have the rise or not doesn't make any difference. Whereas Ladd and Chapman say you always have a rise. There's always a dip between accents. So the rise is necessary. So we go from the rise is rarely there to the rise is always there to the rise is there only if the accents are contrasting. So, okay, what can we make of all of those things? They're all over the place. So here is what we did. We used unscripted data. We have scripted data. We look at them separately. We used unscripted data. This is a relatively small corpus. We have about 2,500 accents, but because of COVID and the move, we were not able. We just got a big set of data that we're now beginning to analyze. What did we do with this data? First of all, as I said, this is unscripted data because we didn't want to have people read from a script. What happens when you do that is people can either exaggerate what they're supposed to be doing, or they cannot do it on cue. Okay, so they end up not producing what you want them to do. So we wanted different styles because we know that different styles can make people use some melodic elements more than others. And this was important because if some of them are rare, you want to have more instances of them. So we had them play story cubes. I don't know if you're familiar with this game. You can see their dice with icons on them. People throw the dice and they have to make up a story about the icons that came up. And people actually enjoyed this very much. They played the map task. You can see the famous thing from here. And we had actually different types of maps, and they did this task which they did not enjoy, which was giving them a number of different objects that are somewhat unusual and having them in pairs trying to figure out what they do. This is a percussion instrument, this is an egg separator, and this is for scoring a citrus fruit, in case you're interested. So what did we do with that? So this was very different because a lot of intonation work is based on let's have them in the lab and read small dialogues to get what we want. Our data was different in at least two more ways. First of all, what typically happens in intonation work, especially in AM, is that the assessment that you do in order to annotate your data tends to be holistic. So the instructions may say, look at the F0, but you listen to the data. So you do have an impression from the duration, the relative amplitude, and the context in which accents appear. Now, we try to use the holistic approach that is the standard 3 times. We did not get good agreement. And finally, I made the decision that we'll have to do them separately. So this is what we did. On the one hand, we annotated the data based only on the shape of the axis. So we listened to them, but based it on the F0 shape. So if there was a rise, that was a low high star. If not, it was a high star. Obviously for high accents, yeah. In addition, we looked at the orthographic transcript, and with the help of Chris Cummings and Hannah Rode from Edinburgh, based on the transcript alone, decided which words could be contrasted in a given context. We didn't know if the participants actually produced it in that way, but that the context gave them the right to do so. You'll see an example shortly. And then we linked the two labels. So we knew which accents were highs and low highs, and then we added the labels contrasting, non-contrasting. The second thing we did, instead of looking at tonal targets, which is the typical thing in AM, we actually looked at larger sections of F0 while keeping the AM understanding in place. So this is from Story Cubes. I was reading my book, right? So on book, you would expect in AM terms to actually look at just this point. If you were doing this in the British school or more in the Ivy corpus or in Wissenhoven's work, you might actually look at the end of the fall as well, but otherwise you will ignore the rest. What we did instead is model the entire curve using prosodic words, and that was based on the finding that from other data that sometimes what happens before and after is really important. Nevertheless, this is what we get. This is the 2,500 accents before we cleaned the data. So there's a lot of error, tracking errors, but yes, this is a blob. And so now the question is, how do you get from this blob to making any sense of the data? And you can see why people may say, okay, I'll give up, or I'll look only at the peak and nothing else. So what we do is we use different types of techniques that are data-driven as much as possible and dimensional reduction oriented. What does that mean? It means that instead of imposing our own structure on the data, we try to be as hands-off as possible. It's not possible to be completely hands-off, but we try to get the data to talk to us. And we use techniques like functional principal component analysis that try to distill from all this noise here what is really essential for the contours and what essential ways, what principal ways these curves differ from each other. Okay. And the other thing that I will show here is GAMS. I will not show all of this. And GAMS is a way of modeling nonlinear data. So normally you have a scattered plot, and then you have a line, and the line tries to is the line that best fits the data. But you cannot actually look at the data as curves. And GAMS in particular are very good for some questions. I don't have the time to go into all this, and if anybody's interested, happy to talk about it. And then we use classifiers such as random forest to see, okay, these are our predictions based on the data. Do they actually make good predictions about how the data really work? So here is the information from the GAMS. I'll be very non-technical. So what you see here is the two curves that the model generates. The yellow curve is the one for the high accent, and the blue curve is the one for the low high accent. Yeah, and we can see they're different. I have the difference plots for anybody who works with GAMS, but if not, I will say very simply, this is the onset of the accented vowel, and this is the part in which the two curves are statistically distinct. So for the high accent, the curve falls. For the low high, it goes up and then falls. Now, this may seem exciting, but it isn't really. It just says that Jisung Kim, who did the annotation, is very good at her job and did an excellent job separating the two accents. But it's a good result because it says, yes, we separated them appropriately. The question is, are they separated in the same way if we look at their pragmatic function? And the answer to that is no. Okay, so if you look at the contrasted non-contrasted accents, you can say that the lines overlap with one another. And there is actually no statistical difference between the two of them. Now, in these contrastive accents, we took a relatively generous approach to what was contrastive. And very recently, the panic discovered that Chris Cummings had actually created a different annotation for us, which was much more conservative about what he called contrastive. And he called contrastive only things that had an explicit mention of an alternative element in the set, right? So have you got a deer in the top right corner? No, I've got a mule. So mule would be contrastive. So this was a much smaller set. And when we compare this much smaller set with all the other accents, we do get a statistically significant difference, such that when you're being corrective, as in a case like this, for want of a better term, you actually do rise from a low point, whereas all the other accents have high. And in fact, when we compare our two annotations, we still find the same result. The corrective accents rise and fall, whereas the rest of the accents we called contrastive do not do that. Okay. So where does that leave us so far? We see that the accents are phonetically there. The phonetics of the accents are not exactly as Pierre Humbert says for American English. And before you say duh, the accents differ in this way phonetically, but there are two things to remember. First of all, a lot of the discussions in the literature have not differentiated across categories on the grounds that English, it's all the same. And second of all, in this data that I've shown you, we see things that I never thought I'd seen in British English, including T flapping and coda R's from native speakers of British English. So it would not be surprising if some elements from American English, underdeveloped and superior of American English, came into the system. But it looks like they are still distinct. That's about the phonetics. The other thing to note is that the low-high star is very infrequent. We have a few hundreds of data compared to thousands for the high star. And this has consequences for learnability. In terms of function, we say that there is a distinction, but it's only about the correctives. It's not the general things that Pierre Humbert mentioned. However, the distinctions are not quite what the British school says. So apart from Daniel Jones, who talked about accents being emphatic or corrective, in fact, everybody else talks about things like if you have a high fall, it's lively, it's involved. So they give you descriptions like that. And in fact, they show the high falls. So the high fall will kind of not here with fall, but they never tell you get them. Not just jump. Okay? You have to have a glider. So in order to address this, we did the second study, which is, it's actually two studies, but I'll show you only one, where we didn't want to put people on the spot. We needed something that was meta-linguistic, but we didn't want it to be very explicitly meta-linguistic. So we used this technique. It has its origins in work that was done in the Netherlands in the 60s. It's called rapid prosody transcription, and it's been popularized since 2010s by Jennifer Cole. So essentially, you give listeners utterances and a transcript of the utterance, and they have to decide which words they think are prominent. So in the second experiments altogether, we have something like 130 participants, and the results come out the same. We had them respond to utterances from the corpus you've seen, and we had accents that we had classified as high or low-high, and as contrastive or non-contrastive. Now, if the low-high is an emphatic version of the high, which is what the British school says and what Ladd says, then we would expect all the low highs to stand out. Okay, we would expect people to go for the phonetic shape. If the accents are distinct in function, then we'd expect this function to play a role, and for the low highs to sound like they are more prominent if the pragmatics match, if that is, they play a contrastive role. And because of individual variation that we had seen in the data, we decided in the second experiment to have our participants also take the autism quotient test, a musicality test, and an empathy quotient test. The musicality test tests ability, not whether you like music. Why did we choose these tests? Because people with a high AQ and people who score high in musicality are said to pay a lot of attention to phonetic detail and intonation, among other things, whereas people who score high in the empathy quotient are said to be more sensitive to pragmatic interpretation and to intonation in particular. And we wanted to say this would explain some patterns we saw in our first experiment, and I'll show you those patterns. I removed the slide for lack of time, but the slide is there if you want to see it. So what did we find? We find that participants are more likely to mark low high accents as being prominent, but also to mark contrasted accents as being prominent. And the two don't interact. Okay? How can we explain these results? We were puzzled. We got two experiments. They show us exactly the same results. And here is what's happening at the individual level that may start to explain what's going on. In one of the bar graphs, the four graphs together show you one participant. So if you look at participant one, what this person does is they are much more likely to mark rising accents as prominent than accents that are just high. If you look at this person, they go for the contrastive accents, right? They don't mark any other accents as much. P3, very clear preference for accents that are rising and contrastive, everything else, very little marking. And then you have people like P4 who do not discriminate so much, everything is there. And we actually have people who give very similar percentages to all types of accents, and these percentages can be very high or very low. So what can the additional findings that we have from AQ and mini prompts and so on help us? They do. So if we look, for example, at AQ, remember AQ means attention to phonetic detail, we find that as far as the low highs are concerned, it didn't make any difference. Everybody was equally likely to mark them independently of how high they went on the AQ scale. However, the people who scored high were more likely to mark the high accents as prominent. One way to think about this is that the people who are low here don't pay a lot of attention to these accents. They pay attention to the rising accents. These people pay attention to phonetic detail, and this phonetic detail makes them be more sensitive to the small changes in the highs, and therefore it makes them less likely to differentiate the two categories. With mini prompts, we find that the higher the musicality, the more likely people were to mark the low highs as prominent. A more useful way to think about that is that if you're not very musical, you are likely not to hear the difference between those two. Okay? So they all sound equally prominent and not very much so. And when we look at the EQ, what we find is again that people who are higher on the EQ scale are more likely to mark contrastive accents in this case as being prominent. So those lower on the scale, which tend to be those high on the AQ, because EQ and AQ negatively correlate, don't make as much of a difference between those accents. So depending on the cognitive style, you may think of the difference between the two types, either on the pragmatic or the phonetic side, as very salient or not so salient. This is the gist. So what can we say in general then about these accents? They're clearly attested in Southern British English, and results that I'm not showing here suggest that the difference between them is not really between a high fall and a low fall. So the height of the peak does not really matter very much. It's not linguistically relevant. The accents don't have clear functions related to information structure, except that unless we talk about, sort of accents that are corrective being distinct, but certainly not in the sense of what Pierre Cambridge and Hirschberg had suggested. Now, this may not seem like a very positive conclusion, but to me, it's a very helpful conclusion because it says, okay, this was a hypothesis and we have eliminated this hypothesis. This is not what's happening. What else could be happening? One thing that could be happening is that the accents that get those rises are for words that are unexpected in discourse, because we find them very often in the story cubes where people say crazy things. I'll show you some examples. And that other cues like duration and amplitude may be at play. So I'll play some examples for you. I hope you can see them. So here is an accent that is clearly rising, but it's new information. We know that for sure from the context. Okay, and the second one, I love this example because it has two accents that have a big rise falls, and then it has the two that they turn to called downstairs, right? And they're clearly falls. Okay, so what are they like?
She saw loads and loads of jumping fish.
Okay. So
she saw loads and loads of jumping fish.
So partly the rise is because she exaggerates the L, but you can see how different the shape and kind of these two accents are compared to those two. And finally, here is another one, which we know is contrastive, but barely moves from being a fall.
Right heron. Right heron.
Okay. And you hear the heron, you hear that she's emphasizing the heron. So clearly she's not doing it with pitch because it's barely arise. Clearly there's something else going on, and this is the next step that we are looking into. Okay, so this shouldn't be here. The RPT at the same time has shown us that the phonetic distinction is not something that all the speakers acquire. That seems to be what is happening here. So depending on their cognitive style, it looks that for some speakers, the two axes may be completely distinct. So for them, these are phonological categories that they are phonological contrast that has specific uses. For others, it may be a fuzzy contrast, and what Scobie has called a marginal contrast. Right? So they may not be very clear about what they're doing with it, what they use it for, and for still others, there may not be any contrast at all if they do not pay a lot of attention to this. And if you remember, the low highs are relatively rare. They may not acquire it as a phonological contrast. And I would venture to suggest, and I hope this is not sacrilegious, that maybe the linguists have worked on this are in the opposite sides of the spectrum. If you pay attention to the correctives versus the new information, you may think they are clearly distinct. In other categories, you may not. Now, this should not surprise us. This has nothing to do with intonation in particular. We know that different people have different degrees of working memory, empathy, audition acuity, articulatory flexibility. So it's not surprising that they may actually acquire different, slightly different grammars in this particular case. And we know, as I mentioned, that frequency plays a part. We know that infrequent patterns don't help with real generalization. So if you have low highs, but because of how they're used, you don't hear them very much, you may not have formed them as a solid separate category. If it's rare, but you actually are very attentive to these kinds of details, you may do so. And as somebody who works on intonation, I know from personal experience that I may say things like, you know, could they have put the focus on this word? And no, people in my family are like, what? What is the problem? So different people have different approaches to this. So to a certain extent, we can say, well, we can say that this is a marginal contrast that some people acquire about the high style and low high style. More generally, I hope that I've shown you that we can study intonation. It is very variable, but not so variable that it is actually overwhelming, though it may seem so. I think it's also very important that we separate what we find difficult to study and what should not be studied. So very often the approach is, oh, intonation is too difficult. I hear that all the time. So they're incurable diseases. Doesn't mean that we should not be doing research on them, right? I mean, I'm not claiming intonation is on that league, but you get my point. And what we need to do is learn how to handle variability. And I hope that I've shown you that this is something that we try to do in Sprint, starting from the position of intonation is tame. We can work with it. So we retain the insights from AM, such as the synchronization between melodic elements and metrical elements. We recognize that it's important to look at variety-specific studies. So we have studies that are based on 2 speakers, one speaker from Scotland, one from London. We have studies comparing British English with American English, and so on and so forth. We also need to consider individual variation because clearly it plays a role, and we cannot just assume that everybody shares the same system. If we did, there wouldn't be any misunderstandings. Nobody would ever ask, are you being ironic? Right? We also try to use methodologies where one of the major things that we try to do is separate what is general variability, which may have to do with how fast you talk, how excited you are, what your pitch range is, from what is the linguistically relevant variation, okay? And using those 2 words as 2 distinct elements. And finally, we have already started doing this, and this is the next step with the data that we just seen. Consider phonetic parameters that go beyond F0, which may help. And this is a step that is very often forgotten, but we don't have any phonetic categories that are realized with just 1 dimension. Everything is redundant, and redundancy is important in speech because otherwise we wouldn't be able to process it. Okay? So to recap, intonation is critical for the study of language and speech. As part of phonology, it interacts with the metrical, rhotic component, it interacts with syntax, it affects the phonetic realization of vowels and consonants, which I didn't have a lot of opportunities to show you, and it plays a role in speech processing by telling speakers and listeners where breaks are. It's essential for acquisition, as we find out. I don't know if you've seen the recent studies that show pitch and rhythm are the things that babies caught on to from the womb, and they're features that appear even in their cries when they're firstborns. And it's an important element for the linguistic system that L2 speakers like me acquire, and atypical speakers. We have just coming out a recent study by Martin Grice's lab showing, for example, that people on the autism spectrum use filled pauses differently from neurotypical adults. So intonation is critical for communication. It affects how we understand pragmatics and conversation analysis. So for all of these reasons, we really need to look at intonation. It is a challenging area, but I think with the newer methodologies like we have the statistical computational tools now that we can tackle a lot of the challenges that used to be much more difficult to deal with in the past. So thank you very much. I'm glad to take questions.